You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
So we're starting at the new tractate of Eruvin. Although I hesitate to say that it's a new tractate, because in fact the Mishnah of Eruvin runs directly on from the Mishnah of Shabbat, almost as if it's an extension to the Mishnah of Shabbat, and it deals with issues of carrying. And we saw already that the first 12 chapters of the Mishnah of Shabbat are focused on carrying. We're going to come back to carrying right through the Mishnah of Eruvin. I hope we'll learn one Mishnah today. We'll start very gently. But in order to learn that Mishnah, we need to learn some terminology. So I hope you'll excuse me if I begin just by talking a little bit about terminology and about life in the Mishnah. And life in the Mishnah revolved around the courtyard. There were houses. People had their own houses, but the house would give on to the courtyard. And in terms of carrying, in terms of Hilchot Shabbat, a house was considered a private domain, but a courtyard was also considered a private domain. And the Mishnah will speak about an alley. An alley in Hebrew is a mabui. A mabui is an alley, and that is also considered a private domain. And I've brought you here a diagram of 4 courtyards. Each courtyard has 5 houses giving onto it. And these 4 courtyards are giving onto an alley. And then the alley may give on at one end or the other end, or perhaps both ends. It might be shut at 3 sides, or it might be only shut at 2 sides. We'll get into that as we learn the Mishnah. The private alley will give on to the street, and the street is the public domain. In fact, I brought you a picture. Here's a picture of an alley which I photographed in Marrakesh just a couple of days for you. You can see, of course, that it's shut at one end and it's open at the other end, and then there's a gate at one end. And the Rambam begins in the Mishneh Torah. I thought we'd start with the Mishneh Torah just in order to understand the concepts. And then we can move on to the Mishnah. He begins by saying, Chatzer sheyesh ba shchenim harbe kol echad mehem bebeit la'atzmo. Din Torah hu sheyu kulan mutarin l'taltel b'chol chatzer. According to Torah, when there are several neighbors, each in a courtyard, but each in his private home, they can all carry within the courtyard, from their homes to the courtyard, from the courtyard to the homes. In other words, just as we've seen the diagram above, we can carry backwards and forwards from the courtyard into the homes. And the same law applies to an alley. V'chen hadin b'mavoi sheyesh lo lechi applies to an alley that has a pole or a beam. Sheyesh lo lechi or korah. A lechi is a pole, and a korah is a beam. And if this alley has got a pole or a beam, we're going to learn about poles and beams. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about poles and beams. If the alley has a pole or a beam, all the inhabitants of the alley are permitted to carry right the way through it. And for that matter, so that they can carry right through the alley, and for that matter, from the courtyard into the alley and backwards and forwards. And then the Rambam concludes, V'chen hadin b'midah shehi mukefet choma. And the same applies to a city that's surrounded by a wall, providing it's 10 hands breadth, 10 tefachim high, and has gates which are locked at night. So this alley is a bit like a city surrounded by a wall. We can carry within it. And here I brought you a picture. I photographed this alley in Marrakesh, but I superimposed on it captions to show you what the Rambam is talking about when he talks about a pole. That's a lechi or a beam. A beam, look, here's the arrow pointing to the beam, runs across the top of the alleyway. So you know when you're walking in and out of the alleyway. And the pole, the lechi, is stuck at the side of the alleyway. It's kind of a marker, to show you whether you're coming in or out of the alleyway. So we need to understand what an alleyway is, and what a beam is, and what a pole is. And once we've got that in, and that's why I put the photograph of this in the source sheet, and once we've got that in our head, we can then understand the first Mishnah. So, the first Mishnah, Mavoi shehu gavoha lamala me'esrim ama yema'et. An alley that is more than 20 cubits high should be lowered. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Eino tzarich, this is not necessary. And we're talking, by the way, about the beam. We're not talking about the alley. Well, this will become clear from context in just a minute. We're talking about how high the beam is, whether this beam at the top of the entrance to the alley is more than 20 amot high. And this Mishnah should remind us of something. It should remind us of we're in the first Mishnah of Eruvin, but it should remind us of the first Mishnah in Sukkah, which says, Sukkah shehi gvoha lamala me'esrim ama psula. A sukkah that is more than 20 cubits high is pasul, is not a sukkah. And just as in our Mishnah, where Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, in this Mishnah as well, Rabbi Yehuda will disagree. Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda says it's kasher. And the Gemara in explaining that Mishnah of Sukkah says, gosh, if the sukkah is more than 20 cubits high, you're not aware that you're sitting in a sukkah. Or at least that is one of the three explanations that the Gemara brings there. That if the sukkah is more than 20 amot high, you're not aware that you're sitting in it. And the Gemara brings exactly this explanation for our alley. That if this beam is let's find the beam here again. If this beam is lower than 20 amot, you won't be aware that it is there. And we need to be aware of the beam when we're coming in and out of the alley. We need to be aware that it's an alley. Otherwise, we haven't done anything to remind the killer as to what the different boundaries are. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Eino tzarich. It doesn't have to be like this. Rabbi Yehuda seems to think that the beam constitutes a physical boundary rather than a psychological boundary. So for Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't make any difference what the height of the beam is, because for him it's a physical barrier. But and the halacha does not go according to Rabbi Yehuda, by the way. But for the halacha goes according to the first opinion, which seems to say this is a psychological barrier. And that's essentially the context of the Mishnah of the Mishneh Torah. And then the Mishnah goes on to say, "V'harachav me'esar amot yema'et." If it's wider than 20 amot, if it's wider than 10 amot, we have to reduce it. What are we doing? We're probably reducing the doorway to this alleyway. If it's got the shape of a doorway, and of course the one in the photograph has the shape of a doorway, if it's got the shape of a doorway, it can be wider. It can actually be wider than 10 amot, and we don't have to reduce down the width of the opening. But if it doesn't have the shape of a doorway, and if there's no beam, if we're relying on the pole rather than the beam, then there isn't necessarily a door shape anywhere at the entrance to this alley. So you might visualize this alley with a pole, but without the beam. The pole on the side is marking out the entrance to the alley, rather than the beam marking it out. And in this case, we would need the entrance to the alley to be less than 10 amot, because we don't have the shape of a door and we're relying on a pole. Now, you may well ask, do we need a pole and a beam? Or can we make do with a pole or a beam? So are they both necessary? And that is a question which we'll discuss in the next Mishnah, which we'll look at tomorrow, the second Mishnah. But if we've got the concepts so far today, we've probably done enough for one day. We've learned the house, the courtyard, these are private domains. The alley, the maboi, that is a private domain as well. And the street, which is public. And in order to distinguish between the alley and the street, we're going to use a pole and a beam, a lechi and a kura.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.